let's welcome to our virtual stage, Jeffery Wang. Hi, Jeffery. How are you?
Good morning, Alex. How you going?
I'm great, thanks. It's so great to have you. Hey, I love your background. It's pretty awesome.
It's the biggest bookshelf I can find. I can see you've got your bookshelf behind you.
I do, but
Uh,
I think I'd prefer yours. It'll be like a dream come true for me, like a kid in a lolly shop when it comes to books. I think I'd prefer yours. Thank you.
well, it's the biggest bookshelf I can download. So
Well done. So everyone, this is Jeffery Wang, and just a little bit about Jeffery before we dive in and ask him some incredible questions. So Jeffery founded the Professional Development Forum in 2007, and the purpose behind that was to help diverse young professionals, just like himself, find fulfillment in the modern Australian workplace. Now, the forum has since heard from multitudes of successful, passionate and inspiring leaders aiming to empower culturally diverse talents to unlock their leadership potential. So I'd like to welcome Jeffery. And, Jeffery, first and foremost, I guess I would love to know, your desire and passion to start the Professional Development Forum. Where did that come from?
well, initially it was out of, I suppose, frustration at the very beginning.
Right.
A group of friends of mine got together and decided that we were not getting the fulfillment that we wanted in our careers. And in order to help ourselves, we got together into a room with probably the most inspirational leader I knew at the time, picked her brains and, learned all the stuff that you learn that you can't learn from a textbook. And we realized
Yes.
that it was such a good experience that we've been doing it every month since then.
Well, nothing, you hit the nail on the head. There's nothing better than experience. You can read as many books as you can, but unless you get your hands dirty, that's where the experience and insights come from. Fantastic. So tell me, Jeffery, why did you get involved in this summit? What was your purpose for accepting our invitation to come onto this summit?
Well, this is very much a passion of mine because I believe that we desperately need better leadership in this country and indeed the world too. Since the COVID pandemic, it has exposed a weakness that we just cannot ignore anymore. I used to believe that there's a grand plan, there are adults in charge, but I think what the pandemic has exposed is that there is no adults in charge, and at least not in most countries around the world.
Wow, that's a powerful point. Tell me, if you don't mind answering the question for me. When you mean adults in charge, would you mind elaborating on that? Because that's a very vital point you make there.
Well, look, that's a very good point, and what I guess I'll delve straight into it
Please, yeah.
and I'll speak about it in the Australian context. In Australia, we responded to the pandemic more in terms of our response as more in terms of how we responded to the pressures that the media were putting on us,
right,
rather than what the actual situation is.
Right.
And unfortunately, as the current state of the media is, it tends to overblow bad news, right, and spin it out of proportion.
Totally agree.
And as a result of that, our leaders tend to be responding to those signals in the media rather than the situation at hand. And I'll, I suppose in contrast, we can say, take a country like Sweden, for example, who have reacted with much more basis in fact. And in fact, one of the media outlets tried to sensationalize the COVID response in Sweden. And what you had was this flurry of people writing in to complain about this sensationalization, right? And so, on one hand, you could say that, we've got the leadership that we deserve as people who respond to those signals. But I'd like to believe that, we deserve, I like to believe that we can do better with our leadership. Certainly.
Yeah. No, you make some great points there. And, it sounds like when we sort of go into, often what happens is if we're not, if we're not ready and we haven't got what we need and we haven't got the toolkit that we need, we sort of go into panic mode. And as you said, we just sort of tend to, solve the problems at hand, which aren't really the problems anyway, are they? It's sort of a more deeper, so we're sort of dealing with what we shouldn't be dealing with. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. Look,
Yeah.
and before we get into any further discussion, I'll probably just make a bit of disclaimer in terms of
Yeah, I was about to
how,
ask you that. Yeah.
yeah, how I'm going to describe things. So first of all, I'm going to be speaking in generalizations and stereotypes, right? The idea here is to provide a framework that we can work with, rather than,
Nice. Yeah.
there's always going to be exceptions to the rule.
Right.
What I'm providing is a mental shortcut to just help us make sense of the world. It
Mm.
doesn't mean that all the leaders that I'm talking about conforms to that stereotype. It doesn't mean that they're all the same, and in
Mm.
fact, what I guess what I'm trying to get at is that when I talk about these stereotypes, what I'm trying to do is the traits that we regard as desirable in these cultures, right? So I'm not going to bore you with academic references today, but that, there are some background research that informs my views, be it through lived experiences, literature, historical tests, or academic studies, and the other thing is that the reality is never going to be black and white, right? So
No.
this is not going to be a discussion about good versus bad.
Mm.
What it is to comprehend the complexities that we deal with, in the real world.
Awesome. Fantastic. So brings me to my next question then, Jeffrey. What
Mhm.
makes you the expert in this particular field? I guess, what makes you the person who is qualified, I guess, to speak about this particular topic specifically?
Well, look, I don't think I'd ever use the word expert in anything,
Mm-hmm.
but I suppose what makes me bring a unique perspective here is the fact that I lived under very different systems. I was born in Taiwan, and then obviously spent a big part of my life in the West. I've lived under very different cultures. I've lived under very different belief systems and different value systems, both in the East and the West. I'm a keen student of world history, both East and the West, and leadership philosophies. I've done studies in my MBAs, and also I participated in the Asia Link leadership program
Wow.
run by the University of Melbourne. And what it did was made me acutely aware of how different the Australian psyche and culture is when compared to the rest of the world, and
Yeah.
especially Asia. And you mentioned before that I also founded the Sydney Professional Development Forum in 2007. And through that, I've managed to interview many leaders about organizational culture and behavior, both here and abroad. And that gives me a unique perspective. And on top of that, I've got my own experience leading organizations in my day job, and also voluntary organizations, from performing arts to political parties. So it's a range of experiences pulled together that allows me to see things from different perspectives that hopefully will offer unique insight.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for sharing all that, because you
Mhm.
have so much experience behind you and have been exposed to so many different cultural leadership styles, I guess, and models as well. And so I'm curious then, what's wrong with the leadership model we have today, do you think?
Okay, and that's a great question. Look, before I jump into that, I'd like to explore what people's idea of, or I suppose what people's current idea of what leadership is.
Great.
And again, generalization here, typically when we talk about leadership in the West, in fact, just jump in the chat window and just throw me a name of a great leader in the Western world.
Mm.
And I'm guessing would be somebody with the likes of Winston Churchill, maybe Abraham Lincoln, Barack Obama. The stereotypical Western leader, I would say, would be someone who was a great communicator. Someone,
Mandela.
Mandela, yes,
Absolutely.
absolutely
He sort of blew
Mandela.
my mind. So thanks, Jeffrey.
um,
So guys, jump in the chat, and as Jeffrey said, pop in who you believe is a great leader for you.
Okay, so look, the chances are it's somebody who is a great communicator, somebody who's strong, who's tall, powerful, confident, somebody who knows with absolute certainty what
Hmm.
they know to be true, right? And look, it is a great style of leadership, and it is absolutely perfect depending on the situation, right? So, for example, in wartime leadership, you need the strongman leader. It is that sort of, it is that sort of leadership that's required. Now, Mandela was a great communicator,
Totally.
definitely.
Hmm.
So we can see that there are merits to the way we view leaders today. JFK, absolutely. JFK is a great leader. Now, there's absolutely merit to the conventional style of leadership. However, a couple of things have changed.
Hmm.
A couple of things have changed. The first thing I'll speak about is this idea of we are currently moving into what we call a postmodern era. So in the past, well, I suppose in the past, we have this orientation to the truth, whereas nowadays it is more an orientation to power. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole philosophies of that, but what we know is that there is a bit of moral relativism that exists today, which adds to the uncertainty. Now, which brings me to my second point, that we are living in the world of VUCA. What that stands for is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it's only speeding up, right? Think about the pandemic, the trade wars, the decoupling of major economies, the escalating tensions, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence, all the fake news. They are only going to get more complex.
Absolutely.
Right? Now, thirdly, and probably most disturbingly, and specifically here for us in Australia, a perfect storm is brewing right here. We need great leadership to lead us out of the most difficult economic time since the Great Depression. Now, let me explain. So Australia has long been known as the lucky country, right? You know that term. Yeah, it's not. Unfortunately, that's not a term of. It's not a compliment, right? What it was said by the author is that we have been asleep at the wheel. We're a great country because we've been given all these natural resources. We've been incredibly lucky, and unfortunately, because of that, we didn't have to work very hard to do very well. And so because we're so lucky, nobody's noticed that we've been asleep at the wheel. So we haven't been focused on productivity growth. We've just been relying on luck, which means that, things like resources, we dig stuff out of the ground, sell to China, and the price is going up, everything is going well. So what could go wrong? Well, unfortunately, the perfect storm is brewing because China's era of unprecedented growth is about to come to an abrupt end, right? With a decoupling of the world economies, that is going to hit us hard. And we're approaching zero interest rates. Now, what that means is that there is an end to what the modern monetary theory, the quantitative easing will be able to cushion us from the fall, right? So in layman's terms, right, and I'll give you a bit of a metaphor to explain the economic situation. So what we've been doing for the last 30 years is that we've been drinking to delay the inevitable hangover.
Wow, I love that.
Right?
Drinking to delay the inevitable hangover.
Well, that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years. But the problem is we've just ran out of alcohol.
Wow. I love that.
And you're about to wake up. And so unfortunately, this is a bit of a situation we find ourselves being forced on us because of COVID. Right? Yes. Now, COVID, unfortunately, also exposed a gaping hole in our leadership philosophies, right? If you look at it, this is something that we could have prevented. I'll start with China. China lacked transparency. China lacked credibility and trust. We did not believe anything that came out of China, which unfortunately later out proved to be true. And China suppressed their only chance of containing the virus at the beginning.
And they are all the necessary qualities and all the critical and vital qualities of true leadership, aren't they?
Absolutely. However, if you take the failures of China and you look at the US, they have a whole different set of problems, which again make them fail in the same. They fail, but in a completely different way. The USA was arrogant. They were incompetent in their handling. They sent sick people back into aged care homes. Their partisan politics basically played right into making the pandemic worse. The fact is that, they had protests, they had all sorts of things that were trying to go at each other, which just did not allow us a chance of actually containing this thing. There's fake news through the roof. And so unfortunately, USA is finding themselves in the situation that they're in. The UK lacked a coherent strategy. And again, at the beginning, they were pretty arrogant towards how they dealt with it. In Italy and Iran, they were completely unprepared, a bit of incompetence. And again, they lacked a coherent strategy. And even the whole World Health Organization was incompetent.
So what I'm hearing then, Jeffrey, and you've raised so many incredible points right there, worldwide really. And what I'm hearing is that nationally, internationally, globally, I guess, we lack true leadership skills. We don't know leadership like leadership should be, you know, like what is leadership, the way that it must be run, the way that it must be, I guess, the way that we must lead as leaders. And I guess we learn from our leaders, don't we? And it is
I
that
think it's
ripple
more,
effect, that domino effect from our leaders that we sort of take on as well within our own organisations and businesses, really.
I half agree. I think it's more a failure of leadership to allow the right decisions or the right information to flow up to the top, right? So it's ludicrous to suggest that we don't have the capability to deal with the situation. However, as the leadership make decisions, you know, what we have is a situation where perhaps the people with the right information, expertise, are not, you know, being put in a position to make those decisions, and certainly they're making decisions with very limited information. So as a result, what I'm finding, and again, you know, this could change in a couple of years. I mean, we're still right in the middle of the pandemic, but I think, you know, time will tell. But I believe that as a result, the response is worse than the disease itself. There are some bright spots. Let me point you to a couple of bright spots. You know, some countries have done noticeably better than others, and which I'll come back to later. But for example, Taiwan has done a good job of containing a virus. Sweden has done a good job of actually have a coherent strategy, and Singapore has done pretty well as well. And I'll come to the reason why they have.
That'll be terrific. That'll be great. So again, coming back to my question then, I mean, pardon me, and thanks for sharing all of that. It's very insightful indeed. And what I'm getting from that, Jeffrey, is that when we, you know, what we're probably not doing enough of is asking enough questions and collaborating and calibrating with our people and including, because it's all good and well to make decisions based on fear factor, but it's not going to do the job, right? It's going to create all of what you just said.
Yep.
Should we include our people and hear what people have to say, perhaps things would be different. But we need to have the right questions to be able to ask and extract the right information. So, you know, I asked you earlier, I think, what is wrong with the leadership model that we have today? Well, I think you've mentioned all of the above. So what is it that we need to fix that? What do we need in that kitty bag, I suppose, to be able to fix those complex problems? And I mean, you know, yeah, what's your view on that?
So yes, so I guess you're sort of jumping to the solution mode, which is that we need to basically use our tools in our kit bag, right? Look, I think there's a couple of things involved. Well, I guess I still want to keep going in terms of defining exactly what stopped us from using all the things in our kit bag, right? And I'll continue with Australia if that's okay.
Let's do it.
Right. So Australian COVID response. What was interesting was that we had a unique situation of being on an island. We could have contained this virus from the very beginning, right? So interestingly, I was already aware of this because prior to, I was actually in Taiwan prior to coming back to Australia, and this is back in January, and they're already in full pandemic mode. So it made me acutely aware of the threat. When I landed in Australia, it's almost like nothing's happening, and that was very interesting. It's like two different worlds, and so Australia had a couple of things going for it in the fact that we had time. We weren't the first to get hit, and we had time until it eventually reached us. Right, and we also knew that something big was happening in China. We knew that we knew that China was lying about the numbers, right? But what we don't know is why they lied. Right, they were downplaying the severity of the virus, not because they were embarrassed, which is what the media tend to think, but because there was an existential threat to the viability of the regime. Right now, why did Australia not know this? Is beyond me, because we have so many people of a Chinese origin living in Australia that could have told you that, right? And the truth is because we have none of those people around the decision making table, like around the table making that decision at the time of this, right? So when Wuhan was shut down, right, that's a warning sign. China does not shut down a city of 1 million people because they're embarrassed. They don't. You have to judge them for not by what they say, but by what they do, right? So, and in fact, most Chinese Australians knew of this threat. So they chose to self-isolate when they returned from China in January, and many advocated to close our entire borders right there and then.
Yeah.
Now that was deemed. I don't know if you remember this, but the media deemed the closure of our borders to China as racist.
Mm.
Right.
Yeah.
Ironically, this was the only chance. It was the only chance that we had of avoiding any prolonged lockdowns that we're experiencing today. Right.
Mm.
So what I'm saying is that had more leaders of either Chinese Australian background that understood this, or leaders who understood China. Now, I'm not saying this is the ethnicity thing at all. I'm saying if you understand the cultural intelligence of how they communicate, how the Chinese communicate, and understand the psyche, then you would have been able to make a very different result for us in Australia.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's understanding and having the, I guess, the skills and the tools to be able to understand and how to break through those cultural communication barriers. Even more than that, what I'm hearing, Jeffrey, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's critical to be really strategic in who you have at the decision-making round table present.
Absolutely.
That is key, because yes, we can have all of whoever we think must be there because they simply carry a title. Are they, though, the right decision makers that we need to have at the table? We don't choose wisely enough. And by we, I mean a lot of leaders just wing it. That thing that you said earlier about just sitting there wishing, waiting and hoping that things are going to work out, and we're sort of just on this ride unknown as to where we're headed, and we're drunk, as you said, and then suddenly we run. I love that, and I'm going to use that moving forward, but suddenly we run out of alcohol and it's like, crap, what are we going to do now? It's really about thinking strategically on who are we bringing to that space. We don't do that well enough.
But the key is communication. You mentioned it, right?
Absolutely.
So one of the key institutions of communication in the West is our media. And unfortunately, this is another area where we've lost, right? So now, had there been more members in the media who had expertise in China or health policy, they would have put some very different pressures on the government. Rather than accusing them of racism, they would have seen what's about to hit us. They would have seen the threat. They would have seen that, this pandemic, and I can quote you media that downplayed the threat of the pandemic all the way through till March.
Yeah. So coming back to, I guess, into the leadership point, which is why we're here today, and to how all of these observations and what's really happening in our world is key, and it's stuff, I suppose, it's things that we can look at, watch, and then explore how can we do it better.
Gotcha.
So this is why then, I guess, in terms of all that's going on, what tools then, what do we need to be able to make it better? Because I mean, we can sit and we can talk about this all day long, and we know where the lag was. What is it that we can do, I guess, to bring it down to simplicity, to what we're here talking about today, is that how can we do it better? What can we gain from all of what we've seen?
All right. Well, it's important to understand that nobody has all the answers, right? So I've just gone through different countries and why they stuffed it up. And the reality is that China had some pretty fundamental failures in leadership in order, the fact that they suppressed whistleblowing, for example, costing valuable time, the fact that they had very little credibility and transparency. Nobody really believed anything they've got to say, right? There's clearly more to be desired from that style of leadership as well, right? Now, the answer is not to say the West is right or the East is right. And in fact, it's the complete opposite. The fact is, the only chance we have of dealing with the complex problems going forward is a combination of both, and understanding what to make in what situation, right? So leadership is contextual to the situation.
That's exactly
right.
And
so a couple qualities that I believe the Eastern style leadership bring to the table, and I'll just talk through those. Now, I'm not saying that these are unique to the East, but what it is that the value of these styles of, the value of these things are cherished in the Eastern philosophies, right? So I'll talk about number one, humility, right? So in the East, humility is regarded as a massive virtue. And it means that, understanding your limitations. Now, Lee Kuan Yew, who's the Prime Minister or former Prime Minister of Singapore, he once famously said that we're ideology free. If something works, we'll keep it. If it doesn't work, we'll throw it out and try something else. That kind of humility, you'll never really hear in the West nowadays. In fact, you get leaders that tells you that you should never apologize, right? But the reality is, nobody is perfect. Why do we ever think that leaders could ever be perfect and know it all? I mean, it's ludicrous to think that there ever would be a leader as such.
You make such a great point. Yeah.
And humility is a great point of is of a good virtue for a leader to have. Other types of other virtues that I think the Eastern style leadership brings includes adaptability. The fact that in the East we just don't expect things to work the way they should, and in fact this is why Silicon Valley has a whole lot of CEOs from Asian backgrounds. Because these people are used to the pace of change. CEOs in India don't assume there is going to be power. They don't assume there's going to be internet. There's things could happen all the time. You've just got to roll with it, right? Leaders in the East also champions the collective mentality. And I know this happens to be a universal value because Harry Truman once said, "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit." Right. So these are the sort of leadership, there are traces that I can see that, these things are universal in its appeal. But what I'm seeing is that, there are certain values which are more championed in one culture over another.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Absolutely. Jeffrey, I have a question for you, if I may, by one of our audience members, if that's okay. Now, Gordon, thank you for the question. Great question. What's the difference between a leader who has power and makes what hindsight shows to be correct decisions? So you mentioned Lee Kuan Yew versus a similar leader who makes historically viewed bad decisions, Chamberlain, for example. Is it simply being right versus wrong? Great question, Gordon, by the way.
Actually, I do. I love that question.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
Yeah. Okay. Now, the Chinese have a funny way of answering things, and they're known for their subtlety. But the first thing that popped into my head is a great Chinese saying. Right? In Chinese, there's a Chinese saying that says you can never judge a hero. And when they say hero, we kind of mean hero as you can substitute hero for leader. You don't never judge a leader by his successes or failures. That's a Chinese proverb. And what it means is that it's the attributes, it's the quality, it's the moral underpinnings of the person that matters rather than whether he wins or loses in a battle. Right. So yes, it's all interesting and fun in hindsight to comment on someone being right and wrong. But I think it's more important to understand the characteristics of what they're trying to achieve and whether they've got the right moral orientation. Right. So now, interestingly, Lee Kuan Yew wasn't always right, and Chamberlain happened to be proved wrong, right? Which, interestingly, Churchill has been proved right in hindsight. Now, if Chamberlain didn't do didn't sort of appease Hitler, we might have been able to stop. We might have been able to stop him earlier on. We'll never know. It's all very easy to say in hindsight. Now, I can't really comment as to what Chamberlain was trying to achieve.
Yeah, and that's fair enough point to make as well. That's absolutely fine. Fantastic. That may be true, but does history share the view of philosophy? Exactly. Does history judge that wisely? So Gordon asks, that may be true, but does history share that view and philosophy? Exactly. Does history judge that wisely?
It depends on who's writing history, doesn't it?
That's exactly right, and we would not know, I guess, at the end of the day.
Well, yes, I guess that's true. But I would also say that those who fail to remember history are doomed to repeat it, and I think we're scarily close to getting close to that, don't you think?
Absolutely. And look, it's about observing, isn't it? And thank you for engaging to our audience as well. That's fantastic. And keep those questions and comments and insights and your experiences coming through. That's really key, because we have a number of incredible leaders on today. But here's the thing, I think it's observing what's worked, what hasn't. It's pretty much as simple as that. History is phenomenal for that. Wouldn't you agree, Jeffrey?
Absolutely. But you need the humility to see that. You see,
Totally.
I think if you have a leader that goes in there, with a very strong view of the world, all you're going to do is collect biases, collect things that confirms your biases, right? You're always going to look at a problem that just reaffirms your biases. And, let's face it, the internet's going to feed you what you want to see. And what you do is this is why we're getting the growing polarization that we have in the world today. But you know, look, I like to share a bit of my dad's wisdom, because my dad has always told me that I've not understood an issue until I can argue it from both sides.
Nice.
And being able to see beyond that polarizing sort of way of arguing is a sign of maturity in the East. So, you know, that is why consensus building is considered one of the most, you know, important attributes of a leader. And interestingly enough, in the West, you know, we tend to have this view that if you were a consensus-seeking person, it's somewhat seen as a weakness, right? Which is, I just don't believe it to be the case. Now, I agree, there's situations where you can't, you know, apologize. There's times that you've got to just, you know, stand your ground, but it's highly contextual on the situation. What I'm trying to say is that we've got to bring in all the elements of leadership from both the East and the West, and then use that together to combat the complexity that we have to deal with today.
Yeah, well said. It's really it's like it's a guide, you know, again, to see where it is that we want to head. And again, coming back to the most simple questions: what's worked, what hasn't, how can we do it differently, you know, and having a look at the lag there, and just going with something different rather than just jumping on a bandwagon for the sake of jumping on a bandwagon.
Absolutely.
And having those biases. Yeah. So this has been terrific, Jeffery, and we've got a few minutes left. So tell me about your view on the future of leadership before we wrap up.
Okay. So look, clearly nobody has all the answers, right?
No.
So we need every single weapon we've got to deal with the challenges that's facing humankind. So number one is understanding that there's no silver bullet, right? There never was. In fact, there never was. Right. Leadership is always about the situation. It's always about the followers, you know, and I think what we don't do is study. There's no study of followership enough, but quite frankly, you know, I think we should be studying followership more, because followership determines the quality of the leaders that we have.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to be said about good followers, you know, and in fact, the countries I was referring to before, Taiwan, Sweden, Singapore, they're great followers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Those are situations that, in fact, those three countries handled the pandemic extremely well. Right. In Taiwan, you know, well, it's a real meritocratic country. In fact, the vice president was a former I can't say that word, but epidemiologist, right? So he's someone who is used to fighting pandemics, and a bureaucrat could get to a position of vice presidency in Taiwan. It just goes on to show the kind of value they put on knowledge, on competence, right?
Yeah, you mentioned they've got great followers, and I like that you said that, but great followers come from extraordinary leaders, because they've got to be able to build that credibility, be able to build that trust and certainty for someone to follow, right? So
I disagree. Sorry.
Yeah.
I disagree.
Yeah, that's fine.
Great leaders emerge out of a group of great followers. And I think that's fundamentally the difference between the East and the West, because I think West believes that the leadership creates followership, whereas the East believes that leadership is elevated from followership.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's a different perspective.
So we get the leader.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but we get the leader we deserve.
Absolutely.
Right? And
I couldn't agree with you more.
So this is a problem, because in the West, you know, we are so used to these big, you know, the people who can communicate well, for example. So we pick leaders based on how well they can speak, how well they can present, how well they can argue a case. It's, you know, quite frankly, that works if you're trying to, you know, elect a bachelor. But if you're trying to run a country, I think, you know, we need to place more emphasis on actual competence, on actual knowledge. And, you know, let's face it, we've got to judge them for their track record. Right?
Do you know what? Jeffery, I love what you said there. I really do. And isn't it interesting how we are so stuck in different ways of thinking? And I really, really love, and I really want to adopt that. Great leaders emerge out of followers. That is incredibly sense. I love it. So thank you for sharing that, because I had never thought of it like that, you know. And I guess it's because we're so stuck and so conditioned in our own cultural way. I think it's important to observe and explore how other countries do it, and maybe implement that, because if that's working, why not?
Exactly.
So,
and it starts with humility, right? the fact is you are able to have this conversation because you have the humility to sit back and go, maybe there's something I've missed.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what we need in all of us. No, not just some of us, not just those in the East, not just those in the West. Everyone needs to sit back and understand. Now, what underpins all that is that we need to return to our orientation to truth, right? What works? What is true? Right? If we're only seeking power, then you'll look for all the information that confirms your biases.
Yeah.
Right? If you're looking for the truth, then what you'll do is you'll see the world for what it is, and you'll look for answers to deal and grapple with the world the way it is, right? And not in your head. And so this is a shared problem for humanity, as I must admit, right? And unfortunately, I think the answer lies only in the spiritual realm. People have to start seeking to be good and moral again in order for us to get good leadership.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. That really, that is such a vital point you make there. Thank you, Jeffrey. And I'm just mindful of the time. We have a couple of minutes left, and I could speak with you all day long. I just love your wisdom and knowledge. So one last thing, Jeffrey, what, if there's one piece of advice you could give leaders right now, I suppose, and I'm sure you've given so much, but just one quick point to our leaders today, what would that be moving forward?
Well, if it's not already obvious,
you've already said it.
Be humble. Be humble. Know that you don't have all the answers.
Nice. Beautiful. Thank you so much.
And seek the truth.
Absolutely. And lastly, Jeffrey, what resources have you available for our audience maybe to tap into, or perhaps in terms of connecting with you?
So please feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn. Happy to connect. And through the Professional Development Forum, we do have available for a range of resources for aspiring leaders, the people of all sorts of backgrounds. And what we do is we give them all this information. We give them the insights from other leaders to help them become better leaders themselves. And so please feel free to visit our website, www.professionaldevelopmentforum.org. Everything is for free because we are here to empower others.
You're incredible, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for your time. And also know that at the end of this summit today, that everyone who attended will receive an email with all the guest speakers and their contact details as well, along with any resources they may want to sort of share with you as well. So that'll be in a following email. So Jeffrey, I just want to say thank you. It has been incredible, and I appreciate you coming on today and sharing all of your insights, experiences and wisdom. Certainly I've learned a lot from you today. And I look forward to, I guess, connecting with you moving forward. I trust you've had a great time as well, and you've enjoyed sharing your insights with us.
Thank you, Alex. It's always fun talking to you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. You enjoy the rest of your day and, hang out with us as well until the end. Terrific. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Cheers.